The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime. This was the observation of British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey in August 1914 as Europe geared up for war following a relatively minor dispute in the Balkans. Grey's sentiment was not shared by most of the British population at the time. They, along with many other peoples in Europe, were excited by the prospect of their country winning glory and honour in battle. A veritable war fever swept the continent, with soldiers being cheered off to war with promises they'd be back home victorious by Christmas. For the past century, Britain had been the most powerful nation on earth thanks to its head start in the Industrial Revolution and massive empire. However, by the time World War I was starting, other nations were catching up, and by the end of World War II, several nations had overtaken. In August 1914, enormous German armies swept through Belgium and northern France, aiming to capture Paris. The French and British managed to stop that advance at Marne in September. Then followed a series of flanking attempts by both sides to get round the other, which extended the front line. Soldiers were equipped with shovels to dig for shelter against enemy fire. Over only a matter of weeks, these individual holes connected to form a series of trenches that not long after the much-promised Christmas of 1914 stretched from the ports of northern France to the border with Switzerland. This western front was to remain largely unchanged for the next 4 years. The British army was vastly outnumbered by the Germans. More troops were desperately needed. Not wishing to turn to forced enlistment, the British government created a recruitment drive, including the famous Lord Kitchener Wants You poster. Recruitment levels soared as thousands signed up to fight for king and country, many never coming back. But people at home did not only experience the war through the friends and family they lost, this was the first time Britain was to experience total war, when all aspects of the economy and society were coordinated to ensure victory. And as more and more working-age men were drafted to the army, more women were needed to fill the roles that were left behind. The women's suffrage movement had been put on hold for the war effort, but the contribution women made through their work in the factories and farms made an overwhelming case for equality. When the war ended, the majority of women left the workforce to make way for the returning soldiers, many accepting that this was expected. But women did gain the right to vote in 1918, and at an equal age 10 years later. The accepted role of women in society was changing, as was the role of government. DORA, the Defence Against the Realm Act, allowed for the reduction of an individual's freedoms and introduced censorship. Compulsory military conscription was added in 1916 as recruitment numbers fell, and that was also the year that David Lloyd George took over as Prime Minister from his Liberal colleague Asquith as head of a coalition Conservative-dominated government. They wanted a successful conclusion to the war and sought other areas outside the Western Front to bring it about. At Gallipoli, at the mouth of the Straits of Constantinople, an Australian, New Zealand and British force failed to connect supplies to their weakening ally Russia and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. More success was had raising Arab rebellions against them in 1917 and 18. The people and resources of the empire supported the British war effort, with contingents of Indian, African and Caribbean forces all fighting in Europe. The British and German navies only fought one major battle at Jutland in 1916, but the German surface ships withdrew and chose to remain in port for the remainder of the war. This allowed the Royal Navy to blockade the North Sea, slowly starving Germany. But the reverse was also nearly true. German submarines, U-boats, sank over 5,000 merchant ships, bringing supplies to Britain during the war. That unrestricted warfare against shipping began to see American casualties. This helped draw the United States into the war in 1917, which was fortunate for Britain as Russia had surrendered. By November 1918, a ceasefire was agreed. The subsequent Treaty of Versailles was meant to secure a lasting peace. This it did not do. The terms of the treaty placed severe penalties on Germany, confiscating territory, reducing the military, and landing a large bill on Germany's doorstep. Attempts at maintaining both the treaty and the peace through the frail supervision of the League of Nations did not last. Still, the Paris Peace Settlement technically provided Britain with the additional territories, meaning the British Empire reached its greatest extent in the 1920s. However, the cracks were already showing. The treatment of indigenous populations by the British had caused much resentment, suffering and death. The resulting civil rights movements, like Gandhi's Satyagraha in India, were difficult to control. Britain also had to contend with other problems, such as tying itself to a thorny promise to create a settlement for Jewish people in their ancient homeland, now considered very much Palestinian by the current inhabitants. And the careless redrawing of the map in the Middle East between French and British administrations, the Sykes-Picot line, ignored all geographic and demographic contours and caused bloodshed for generations to come. At home, the interwar period saw many economic problems. In 1926, the general strike saw millions of workers down tools, and a few years later the Great Depression saw millions more unemployed. Heavy industrial regions were hardest hit, and hunger marches such as the Jarrow Crusade of 1936 highlighted the terrible conditions some Britons faced. The political activity of the working class also led to the rise to prominence of the Labour Party, which had its origins in trade unions. During the interwar period, Labour even achieved power as a minority government and then as part of a coalition. 26 of the 32 counties of Ireland also regained power from Britain, becoming the Irish Free State. Their journey to independence had been violent, most notably the Easter Rising of 1916 that had been the largest uprising in Ireland since the rebellion of 1798. Seemingly, Victorian standards of duty to the crown were being questioned everywhere. There were sizable communist and fascist movements at this time, and in 1936 there was a huge uproar when the king himself abdicated his position as head of state to be with the woman he loved. The war and Great Depression shattered the British economy, but its effects were felt even more radically in Europe. Many countries there turned to extreme patriotic and anti-foreign philosophies, like Mussolini's Italy and Franco's Spain. Nowhere was this more the case than in Germany, where Hitler's National Socialist Party took power in 1933. Hitler pursued a foreign policy designed to reverse the Treaty of Versailles, rearming the military, reoccupying the demilitarized Rhineland, and uniting with other ethnic German communities in neighboring countries. Prime Minister Chamberlain tried desperately to avoid another war, even going so far as to agree to the fragmentation of Czechoslovakia. But Hitler continued to push his agenda, assuming his unexpected alliance with the now communist Russia protected him from any Anglo-French retaliation. But Britain and France stuck to their pledge to defend neutral Poland, and when Germany invaded, war was declared. This time there were no celebrations, no war fever like there had been 25 years earlier. But the first 6 months of the war, nothing of note happened in Britain. It became known as the Phony War. Of course, not so phony if you were Polish. The British and French did not want to commit to invading Germany. They waited for Germany to attack instead, assuming there'd be a repeat of World War I's trench warfare in northern France. But when the German army finally did mobilise, it was not west into France and Belgium, but north into Denmark and Norway. Their victory there was stupendous. Denmark surrendered within 6 hours. The very same day, Germany was able to advance into Norway. The failure of the British to not prevent the occupation of Norway led to Prime Minister Chamberlain's resignation and the formation of a coalition government under previous Conservative outsider Winston Churchill. His appointment coincided with the Germans finally invading Western Europe. In 6 weeks, Germany achieved what they had failed attempting for 4 years a generation earlier. Using concentrated deployment of forces, a tactic called Blitzkrieg, the Germans had occupied Paris by June 1940. It was at this point that the British Empire stood alone against Nazi Germany and her allies. The situation was desperate. Lord Halifax, who had been many people's preferred choice to take over from Chamberlain, argued peace negotiations should begin, but Churchill, a great orator, convinced his cabinet, then Parliament, and then the general population to continue the fight. And in the Battle of Britain, the RAF were able to prevent the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, from gaining air superiority. The United States, under the sympathetic presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt, was prepared to support Britain financially, but not militarily. But with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt had the argument he needed to get Congress to agree to enter the war. Like the German and Italian empires, Japan had been expanding its territory. It viewed the American Pacific Fleet as a threat and looked to neutralize it. Germany and Italy supported their ally Japan by declaring war on the US, and America took a Germany-first approach to the war. Britain had gained another ally in June 1941 when the Nazis broke their non-aggression pact with the USSR. Despite huge initial advances, the Soviet Union under Stalin did not surrender. In World War II, it was the Russians who did most of the fighting and most of the dying. Over 22 million Russians died compared to less than 1 million Britons. However, those casualties included a far larger proportion of civilians than any other previous war, despite the government's attempts to prevent it. Children and other key or vulnerable sections of society society were evacuated from city centres. Rationing and conscription were immediately enacted. Bombing raids, particularly the Blitz, and later unmanned attacks by V-1 and V-2 rockets were endured, and the so-called Blitz spirit was fostered. These experiences meant all British citizens felt the hand of war and ignited demands for changes in society that were to shape post-war Britain. By 1942, the tide of war had turned against Germany. Its resources were overstretched and its list of enemies were growing longer. The Russians began advancing towards Berlin from the east and the American-led forces from the south and west. Germany surrendered in May 1945 and Japan 3 months later following the use of atomic bombs. Britain ended the war on the winning side, though they had been near bankrupted by the process. The end of the war saw two clear superpowers emerge in the world, and neither was Britain. This period begins with the First World War in the late summer of 1914. As the conflict continued, a stalemate was reached which slowly wore down both sides' resources. Britain emerged on the winning side, but the effort had exhausted their resources. The economic depression of the early 1930s only added to the problems. When Britain went to war again in 1939, it was with great reluctance. Britain again emerged on the winning side in 1945, but completely bankrupt and no longer the powerhouse it had been.